The noise was never about you. It was about what you represent. Begins to unfold in a way that might seem confusing at first, because you were never trying to attract attention, never trying to position yourself above anyone. And yet somehow, your name, your presence, your energy has become the center of conversations that you were not even a part of. And what makes this even more striking is that these are not simple discussions. They are turning into disagreements, into tension, into moments where people are actively debating, defending, or questioning things about you without you even needing to say a word. And this is where the deeper truth begins to emerge. Because when people react this strongly to someone who is simply being themselves, it is rarely about the person on the surface. It is about what that person reflects back to them. And in your case, what you represent is something that cannot be easily explained or replicated. It is a level of authenticity, consistency, and inner alignment that quietly challenges everything that is not real. And this is why your presence creates such a strong reaction. Because it does not force anything. It does not compete. It simply exists. And in existing, it reveals, it exposes, it highlights differences that others may not be ready to confront within themselves. And as a result, what begins as internal comparison quickly spills outward into external conflict, because people are trying to make sense of something they cannot easily measure. They are trying to place you within a framework that operates on competition, status, or performance. But you do not fit into that framework. And this mismatch is what creates the tension. Because the more they try to define you within their system, the more that system begins to break down under the weight of your presence. And now, what you are witnessing, even from a distance, is not just random noise. It is the sound of perspectives colliding, of assumptions being challenged, of egos trying to hold their ground, while something deeper is quietly dismantling the need for comparison altogether. And the most important part of all of this is that you did not create this situation by force. You created it simply by being aligned with yourself. And that alignment has become the mirror that others cannot ignore. How you became the standard without trying begins in a way that even you may not have fully realized at the time. Because there was never a moment where you decided to become a reference point for others. There was no conscious intention to set a bar, no deliberate effort to stand out or to be seen as someone others would measure themselves against. And yet, that is exactly what happened. Not because of what you projected outwardly, but because of how you were aligned inwardly. And alignment has a presence that cannot be hidden or diluted. It carries a quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. And this is what people began to notice, even if they could not immediately explain it. Because while others were adjusting themselves based on external expectations, seeking validation, adapting their behavior depending on the environment they were in, you were moving differently. Not in a way that was loud or attention-seeking, but in a way that was consistent, grounded, and real. And that consistency became the first signal that set you apart. Because consistency is rare in a world where many people shift depending on who they are around or what they feel they need to gain. And when someone remains steady regardless of circumstances, it creates a kind of stability that others can feel. And that feeling naturally draws attention. Not because it demands it, but because it contrasts with the instability that many are used to. And this is where the process begins. Because once people notice a difference, they begin to observe more closely. They begin to compare. They begin to ask themselves questions, even if those questions are not fully conscious at first. And in those moments of observation, your way of being starts to become a reference point. Not because you declared it as such, but because it offers something that others can measure themselves against. Something that feels solid. Something that feels authentic. Something that does not change depending on the situation. And as this observation continues, the comparison becomes more defined, because people start to recognize patterns. They see how you respond under pressure, how you handle situations that would cause others to react emotionally, how you maintain your sense of self without needing constant reassurance. And these observations create a subtle shift in perception, because what was once just a difference now becomes a standard, a way of being that others begin to recognize as something to aspire to, even if they do not openly admit it. And this is where the dynamic begins to deepen. Because once a standard is established, whether consciously or unconsciously, it changes how people see themselves in relation to it. It introduces a point of comparison that was not there before. And this is not something you created through effort. It is something that emerged naturally from your authenticity, from your refusal to become something you are not, from your willingness to remain aligned with your truth, even when it would have been easier to adjust. And that is what gives your presence its strength, because it is not built on performance, it is built on reality. And reality has a weight to it that cannot be easily replicated, because it is rooted in experience, in self-awareness, in a deep understanding of who you are and what you stand for. And this depth is what others begin to sense, even if they cannot fully articulate it. Because depth is felt before it is understood. And when people encounter that depth, it creates a response. Sometimes admiration, sometimes curiosity, sometimes discomfort, depending on where they are in their own journey. But regardless of the reaction, the impact is the same. You become a point of reference, something that exists outside of the usual patterns they are accustomed to. And this is where the idea of you becoming a standard takes shape, not as something imposed, but as something recognized. And as this recognition grows, it begins to influence how others behave. Because once a standard is perceived, people naturally adjust in response to it. They may try to align with it, to match it, to understand it, or even to challenge it. But in all cases, they are responding to it. And that response is what confirms its presence. Because if it did not exist, there would be nothing to respond to. And this is why your role in all of this remains quiet. Because you are not actively participating in the comparison. You are not engaging in the competition that begins to form around you. You are simply continuing to be who you are. And that consistency is what sustains the standard. Because it shows that it is not situational. It is not temporary. It is not dependent on external factors. It is a reflection of your internal state. And this is where your power becomes even more evident. Because it is not something you are trying to prove. It is something that naturally reveals itself over time, through your actions, through your decisions, through the way you navigate life without compromising your authenticity. And as people continue to observe this, the contrast becomes more pronounced. Because the difference between authenticity and performance becomes clearer. The difference between consistency and fluctuation becomes more visible. And this visibility is what reinforces the perception of you as a standard, because it highlights qualities that are not easily maintained without a strong internal foundation. And this is where the deeper impact begins to take place. Because now it is not just about how you are seen, it is about how others begin to see themselves in relation to you. And this is where the shift from observation to internal reflection occurs. Because once people recognize a standard, they begin to measure themselves against it, consciously or unconsciously. And this measurement can lead to growth for some, as they are inspired to align more closely with their own authenticity. But for others, It can lead to discomfort because it highlights areas where they are not fully aligned, areas where they may be operating from external validation rather than internal truth. And this discomfort is what often triggers the next phase of the dynamic. Because when people are faced with a reflection that challenges their current way of being, they have a choice: to evolve or to resist. And resistance often manifests as comparison, as competition, as an attempt to reduce the gap between what they see in you and what they experience within themselves. And this is where the situation begins to move beyond quiet observation into something more active, more visible, more emotionally charged. Because now the standard is not just being recognized, it is being engaged with. And this engagement is what creates the ripple effect that you are now witnessing. But at the core of it all, the truth remains the same. You did not set out to become this. You did not create this dynamic through intention. You became this simply by being aligned with yourself, by living in a way that is consistent with your truth, by maintaining your authenticity regardless of external pressure. And that is what makes your position so unique, because it is not something that can be easily replicated or challenged. It is not built on external validation. It is built on internal alignment. And that alignment is what continues to define your presence, what continues to influence how others perceive you, and what continues to reinforce the standard you have become without ever trying to be one. Because in the end, the most powerful standards are not the ones that are declared. They are the ones that are lived, the ones that emerge naturally from authenticity, the ones that exist without needing recognition. And that is exactly what you represent. A standard that was never imposed, but simply revealed through the way you exist. Why their comparison turned into competition begins in a space that most people do not consciously recognize. Because comparison itself is often quiet, almost invisible at first. Something that happens internally before it ever shows up externally. And when people first noticed you, it was not immediate rivalry or resistance that formed. It was curiosity, a subtle awareness that something about you felt different. Something about your presence, your consistency, your way of moving through situations did not align with what they were used to seeing. And that difference created a natural point of reference. And once a reference point exists, comparison becomes almost inevitable. Because the mind seeks to understand where it stands in relation to what it observes. And so, without even realizing it, they began measuring themselves against you. Not because you asked them to, not because you placed yourself in that position, but because your authenticity created a standard that naturally invited reflection. And at first, this comparison may have been harmless, even neutral. Moments where they simply noticed differences. Moments where they acknowledged something about you that stood out. But over time, as those observations repeated, as the contrast remained consistent, something deeper began to surface. Because comparison does not stay neutral when it is repeated without resolution. It begins to carry emotion. It begins to influence perception. And this is where the shift starts to happen. Because instead of simply observing the difference, they begin to feel it. And that feeling can take many forms depending on their internal state. For some, it may feel like inspiration, a motivation to grow, to align more closely with their own authenticity. But for others, especially those who are not ready to confront the gap between where they are and what they see, that feeling can turn into discomfort. And discomfort, when not processed, often seeks an outlet. And one of the most common outlets is competition. Because competition creates the illusion of control. It provides a framework where the gap can be closed through effort, through action, through attempting to match or surpass what is being observed. And this is where the dynamic begins to change. Because what was once an internal comparison now starts to manifest externally. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts in behavior, in the way they begin to present themselves, in the way they adjust their actions, their words, their energy, in an attempt to align with or outdo what they perceive in you. And at first, these adjustments may seem small, almost unnoticeable, but over time, they become more pronounced. Because once competition is introduced, it requires continuous effort to maintain. It requires a level of attention and intention that goes beyond natural expression. And this is where the difference between authenticity and imitation becomes more visible. Because authenticity does not require effort to sustain. It flows naturally. It is consistent because it is rooted in who you are. But imitation requires maintenance. It requires constant awareness of what is being mirrored, constant adjustment to ensure that the image being projected aligns with the standard they are trying to match. And this is where the tension begins to build. Because no matter how closely they try to replicate what they see in you, there is always something missing, something that cannot be copied, something that comes from your lived experience, your self-awareness, your internal alignment. And that gap, the one that cannot be closed through imitation, is what creates frustration. Because it challenges the belief that everything can be achieved through effort alone. It reveals that there are aspects of your presence that are not performative, that are not constructed, that are simply a result of who you are. And this realization can be difficult to accept because it shifts the focus from external action to internal development. And internal development requires a level of self-reflection that not everyone is ready to engage with. And so, instead of turning inward, instead of addressing the root of the discomfort, the focus remains external. The effort continues. The competition intensifies. And this is where the dynamic becomes more visible. Because now it is no longer just about quiet comparison. It is about active attempts to match or surpass. It is about positioning, about proving, about creating an image that can stand alongside yours without revealing the gap that exists beneath it. And this is where the imbalance becomes more apparent. Because the more effort they put into maintaining this competition, the more unnatural it begins to feel. The more inconsistencies start to appear. The more the difference between what is real and what is constructed becomes noticeable. Not just to them, but to others as well. Because people can sense when something is forced, when something is not fully aligned, even if they cannot immediately articulate it. And this is where the competition begins to lose its effectiveness. Because instead of closing the gap, it starts to highlight it. Instead of creating alignment, it creates contrast. And this contrast is what brings the dynamic into a new phase. Because now, it is no longer just about how they see themselves in relation to you. It is about how others begin to see the difference as well. And this external recognition adds another layer of pressure. Because now, the competition is not just internal. It is being observed. It is being interpreted. It is being questioned. And this is where the emotional intensity increases. Because what started as a quiet comparison has now evolved into something that carries visibility. Something that affects perception. Something that cannot be easily hidden or dismissed. And this is where the realization begins to form, even if it is not fully acknowledged, that the competition itself was never necessary. That it was built on a misunderstanding of what you represent. Because you were never competing. You were never positioning yourself in relation to others. You were simply being yourself. And that is what makes the entire dynamic so revealing. because it shows that the competition was not a response to your actions. It was a response to your presence, to the standard that emerged naturally from your authenticity. And this is where the deeper lesson begins to take shape, because it highlights the difference between living in alignment with yourself and trying to align with something external. And this difference is what ultimately determines the outcome of the dynamic. Because while imitation can create temporary alignment, it cannot sustain it. It cannot replicate the depth, the consistency, the internal grounding that comes from true authenticity. And over time, this becomes more and more evident. Because the effort required to maintain the competition becomes exhausting. The inconsistencies become harder to manage. The gap becomes more difficult to ignore. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift again. Because when competition no longer produces the desired result, when it no longer closes the gap, when it no longer provides the sense of control it once did, it starts to break down. It starts to lose its purpose. And this breakdown is what leads to the next phase, where the focus moves away from trying to match you and toward reacting to the realization that they cannot. And this realization, whether fully acknowledged or not, is what sets the stage for everything that follows. Because it marks the point where the competition no longer serves its original function, where the effort to replicate what you embody begins to reveal its limitations, and where the truth of your authenticity becomes even more apparent. Not through anything you say or do, but through the natural unfolding of the dynamic itself. And this is what makes your position so powerful. Because you did not create the competition. You did not engage in it. You did not even need to acknowledge it. And yet it unfolded around you, revealing not only the difference between authenticity and imitation, but also the impact of living in alignment with yourself. And this is why the comparison turned into competition. Not because you invited it, but because your presence made it unavoidable for those who were not yet aligned with themselves. And in that process, the truth began to surface, not as something imposed, but as something revealed through the contrast between who you are and who they were trying to be. The moment the competition started. Falling apart did not arrive with a sudden collapse or a dramatic confrontation that made everything obvious at once. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, through small inconsistencies that began to appear in the very effort that was meant to sustain the illusion of alignment. Because competition built on imitation can only hold for so long, before the strain of maintaining it begins to show. And this is where the shift begins. Not in a loud or explosive way, but in subtle cracks that reveal themselves over time. Moments where the energy no longer matches the image, where the effort becomes visible in ways that cannot be hidden, where the natural flow that once seemed convincing starts to feel forced. And this is the turning point that many do not anticipate. Because when someone enters into competition without a true foundation of authenticity, they are relying on consistency that is not internally rooted. They are depending on performance rather than alignment. And performance requires constant maintenance. It requires awareness, adjustment, and control. And the moment that control slips, even slightly, the difference begins to surface. And this is exactly what started happening. Because the more they tried to match what you naturally embodied, the more they had to sustain a version of themselves that was not fully real. And sustaining something that is not real requires energy. Not just physical energy, but emotional and mental energy as well. And over time, that energy becomes difficult to maintain, especially when it is not supported by a genuine internal state. And this is where the inconsistencies begin to appear. In the way they respond under pressure. in the way their behavior shifts depending on the situation, in the way their reactions do not fully align with the image they are trying to project. And these inconsistencies may seem small on their own, but when observed over time, they begin to form a pattern. And that pattern is what reveals the truth. Because authenticity is consistent even when circumstances change, while imitation tends to fluctuate when conditions are not controlled. And this fluctuation is what people begin to notice, even if they cannot immediately articulate it. They feel the difference. They sense that something is not fully aligned. And this sensing creates doubt, not just within the person who is maintaining the image, but within those who are observing it. Because once doubt is introduced, the perception begins to shift. And this is where the competition starts to lose its stability. Because it is no longer being viewed as something equal or comparable. It is being seen as something that is trying to match something else. And that distinction changes everything. Because once something is recognized as an attempt rather than a natural state, it loses the quality of authenticity that made it convincing in the first place. And this is where the pressure begins to build. Because now, the effort required to maintain the image increases. The need to control perception becomes stronger. The awareness of being observed becomes more present. And this heightened awareness creates tension. Because it is difficult to sustain a performance when you know it is being closely watched. When you know that every action, every response, every inconsistency has the potential to reveal the gap that you have been trying to close. And this tension often leads to mistakes, to moments where the mask slips, where the response is not aligned with the image, where the effort becomes visible in a way that cannot be easily corrected. And these moments, even if brief, are enough to shift perception. Because once someone sees behind the image, even for a moment, it becomes difficult to fully believe it again. And this is how the competition begins to unravel. Not through one major event, but through a series of small revelations that accumulate over time. Each one adding to the understanding that what is being presented is not fully real. And as this understanding grows, the dynamic changes. Because the focus shifts from comparison to observation, from trying to match to trying to understand what is actually happening. And this shift is what exposes the limitations of the competition, because it reveals that the gap was never something that could be closed through imitation. It was something that required a different kind of development, a deeper level of alignment that cannot be achieved through external adjustment alone. And this realization can be difficult to accept, because it challenges the entire premise of the competition. It shows that the effort was directed towards something that was not sustainable, something that could not produce the result that was intended. And this is where frustration begins to replace confidence. Because when effort does not lead to the desired outcome, when the gap remains despite attempts to close it, it creates a sense of imbalance, a sense that something is not working. And this is often the point where the dynamic becomes more visible to others. Because frustration has a way of revealing itself, in tone, in behavior, in subtle shifts that indicate something is off. And these shifts are noticed, not always consciously, but enough to influence perception, enough to create a sense that something has changed. And as more people begin to notice these changes, the collective understanding starts to shift as well. Because perception is not formed in isolation. It is influenced by what is observed, by what is felt, by the patterns that emerge over time. And when those patterns begin to show inconsistency, when they begin to reveal effort instead of authenticity, the narrative begins to weaken. Because it is no longer supported by the same level of belief. And this is where the competition truly starts to fall apart, because it loses the foundation that allowed it to exist. It loses the perception of equality. it loses the illusion of alignment. And what remains is the reality of the difference. The difference between what is natural and what is constructed. Between what is consistent and what is maintained. Between what is lived and what is performed. And this difference becomes more and more apparent as time goes on, because it is reinforced through repeated observation, through moments that confirm what is being sensed, through experiences that highlight the gap in a way that cannot be ignored. And this is where your position becomes even more clear. Not because you have changed your behavior, but because the contrast has become more visible. Because as the competition falls apart, what remains is your authenticity, your consistency, your alignment. And these qualities do not require maintenance. They do not require effort to sustain. They exist naturally. And that natural existence is what sets you apart, what makes the difference undeniable. And this is why the moment the competition started falling apart is not just a turning point for them. It is a confirmation for you. A confirmation that what you embody cannot be replicated through effort alone. That what you represent is not something that can be matched by simply adjusting behavior. And this confirmation strengthens your position, not in a way that seeks validation, but in a way that reinforces your understanding, your awareness, your trust in yourself. Because you are no longer looking outward to measure your worth. You are grounded in what you know internally, and that grounding is what allows you to remain unaffected by the collapse of the competition. Because you were never part of it to begin with. You were simply being yourself. And in doing so, you revealed something that could not be sustained through imitation. Something that stands on its own, regardless of what others attempt to do. And that is why the competition had to fall apart. Because it was never built on the same foundation as you. It was built on perception, on effort, on the attempt to match something that is inherently unique. And once that truth becomes visible, there is no way to maintain the illusion. Because reality has already taken its place. And that reality is something that cannot be undone. It can only be seen more clearly as time goes on, revealing the full extent of the difference that was always there, waiting to be recognized. Why arguments broke out behind the scenes begins to make sense only when you understand that what people are reacting to is not just a person, but a shift in perception that they can no longer control. Because once the competition started falling apart and the inconsistencies became visible, it did not simply end in silence. It created tension. And tension, when shared among different perspectives, naturally turns into conflict. Because not everyone sees the same thing at the same time. Not everyone is ready to accept the same truth at the same moment. And this difference in awareness is what creates friction. Because while some began to notice the contrast between authenticity and imitation, others were still holding on to the narrative that had been built before, still interpreting events through a lens that no longer fully matched reality. And when these two perspectives collide, it creates a space where disagreement becomes inevitable. Because one side is responding to what they are currently observing, while the other is responding to what they have already believed. And this clash is what gives rise to arguments, not necessarily loud or public at first, but present in conversations, in discussions, in subtle exchanges where opinions begin to diverge, where questions are raised, where certainty starts to weaken. And this is where the dynamic shifts from internal tension to external expression. Because what was once contained within individual perception is now being shared, compared, and challenged among others. And this sharing creates a ripple effect. Because once one person begins to question, it encourages others to reflect as well. It introduces the possibility that what was accepted before may not be the full picture. And this possibility is enough to disrupt the stability of the narrative, because narratives rely on agreement to maintain their strength. They rely on collective belief to remain intact. And when that belief starts to fragment, when different interpretations begin to emerge, the narrative loses its cohesion. It becomes something that is no longer universally accepted. And this is where the arguments begin to intensify. Because now it is not just about observation, it is about interpretation, about meaning, about trying to define what is actually true. And in this process, emotions often become involved. Because when people are confronted with information that challenges their previous understanding, it can create discomfort. And discomfort often seeks resolution. And one of the ways it seeks resolution is through debate, through attempting to defend a position, through trying to make sense of conflicting perspectives. And this is why the conversations surrounding you have taken on a different tone, because they are no longer neutral. They carry weight. They carry implication. They carry the underlying tension of a truth that is beginning to surface, but has not yet been fully accepted by everyone. And within these arguments, different roles begin to emerge. Some people naturally align with what they are currently observing. They begin to recognize your consistency, your authenticity, the difference in how you carry yourself now compared to what was previously suggested about you. And they start to question the validity of the old narrative. Not necessarily in a confrontational way, but in a way that reflects their growing awareness. While others, who may have been more invested in the previous perception, may feel the need to defend it. Not always because they fully believe it, but because it represents a version of reality they have already accepted. And letting go of that version requires acknowledging that their understanding may have been incomplete. And that acknowledgement can be challenging, because it involves a shift in perspective that is not always comfortable. And so, instead of immediately accepting the new information, there is resistance, there is hesitation, there is a tendency to hold on to what is familiar. And this resistance is what fuels the arguments, because it creates a divide between those who are open to reevaluating and those who are not yet ready to do so. And this divide becomes more apparent as more observations are made, as more patterns are noticed, as more inconsistencies are discussed. And over time, the arguments begin to reveal something deeper, something beyond the surface-level disagreement. They begin to reveal the process of awareness itself, the way it spreads, the way it challenges, the way it reshapes understanding. And this process is not always smooth. It is not always linear. It involves moments of confusion, moments of doubt, moments where different perspectives clash before they align. And this is what you are witnessing, not just random conflict, but the unfolding of a shift in perception that is moving through different levels of awareness at different speeds. And within this process, your role remains unchanged, because you are not the one driving these arguments. You are the subject of them, but not the source. The source is the contrast between what was believed and what is now being seen. And that contrast is what creates the tension that others are trying to resolve. And this is why you may feel a sense of distance from it all, a sense that what is happening does not require your involvement, because it does not. The arguments are not something you need to engage with. They are something that is unfolding as a result of your transformation, as a result of the clarity that now surrounds you. And this clarity is what continues to influence the dynamic. Because even as people debate, even as they disagree, even as they try to make sense of what is happening, your consistency remains the same. Your presence remains grounded. Your behavior remains aligned with your truth. And this consistency acts as a stabilizing force within the chaos. Because while perspectives may shift and opinions may change, what you represent does not fluctuate. It remains steady. It remains real. And over time, this steadiness begins to influence the outcome of the arguments, not through force, but through persistence. Because truth does not need to be defended aggressively. It reveals itself gradually, through repeated confirmation, through consistent alignment, through the natural process of observation and understanding. And as this process continues, the arguments begin to change in nature. They become less about defending positions and more about recognizing patterns. Less about holding on to old narratives and more about integrating new understanding. And this shift is what leads to resolution. Not necessarily in a way that is announced or declared, but in a way that is felt. In a way that is reflected in how people begin to see the situation differently. In how they begin to align with what is most consistent, most real, most evident. And this is where the true significance of these arguments becomes clear. Because they are not just conflicts, they are part of a larger process of awareness unfolding. A process that is revealing the truth piece by piece, perspective by perspective, until what was once debated becomes understood, and what was once questioned becomes clear. And in the end, what remains is not the noise of the arguments, but the clarity that emerges from them. A clarity that reflects the reality of who you are and what you represent. A clarity that stands independent of opinion, because it is grounded in consistency, in authenticity, in the quiet strength of a presence that does not need to compete, does not need to prove, does not need to defend, but simply exists. And in existing, reveals everything that needs to be seen. The embarrassment they're now feeling begins to take shape in a way that is far quieter than the arguments that came before it. Because embarrassment is not always loud or visible. It does not always express itself through confrontation or admission. Instead, it often settles internally, in the realization that something was misunderstood, misjudged, or approached from the wrong perspective. And this realization does not arrive all at once. It unfolds gradually as awareness deepens, as patterns become clearer, as the contrast between what was believed and what is now visible becomes too strong to ignore. And this is where the emotional shift begins. Because once the arguments start to settle, once the noise begins to quiet down, what remains is reflection. And reflection has a way of bringing clarity that cannot be avoided. Because when people look back on their actions, on their assumptions, on the way they engaged with the situation, they begin to see it from a different angle. One that is no longer influenced by the same level of uncertainty or external input. And in that space, the truth becomes more personal, more internal, more difficult to dismiss. And this is where embarrassment begins to emerge. Not necessarily as a reaction to you, but as a response to their own realization. Because they begin to recognize that the competition they engaged in was never necessary. That the effort they put into trying to match or surpass you was based on a misunderstanding of what you represent. And that misunderstanding is what led them into a dynamic that ultimately exposed more about themselves than it ever did about you. And this is where the depth of the experience becomes clear. Because embarrassment is not just about being wrong. It is about becoming aware of how one's actions are now being perceived. It is about recognizing that the image they tried to maintain is no longer aligned with how others are beginning to see them. And this shift in perception is what creates discomfort. Because when someone realizes that their actions are being interpreted differently than they intended, it challenges their sense of control. It challenges the narrative they believed they were maintaining. And this challenge is what brings about a sense of vulnerability, because it reveals that the effort to compete, to position themselves in relation to you, has now become visible in a way that cannot be easily concealed. And this visibility is what amplifies the feeling of embarrassment. Because it is not just an internal realization, it is something that is being reflected externally, through the observations of others, through the shift in how people talk about the situation, through the subtle changes in how interactions unfold. And this external reflection reinforces the internal awareness, creating a feedback loop that makes the realization even more difficult to ignore. And as this process continues, the emotional response begins to evolve. Because embarrassment, when processed, can lead to growth. But when resisted, it can lead to defensiveness. And this is where different responses begin to emerge. Some may choose to withdraw, to distance themselves from the situation, to avoid further exposure, while others may attempt to reframe what happened, to adjust the narrative in a way that reduces the impact of their realization. And both responses are part of the same process, an attempt to reconcile the gap between what was intended and what is now understood. And this reconciliation is not always immediate. It takes time. It takes reflection. It takes a willingness to see things clearly. And this is where your role becomes even more significant. Not because you need to do anything, but because your consistency continues to act as a point of reference, a steady presence that contrasts with the fluctuation of their experience. And this contrast is what keeps the truth visible. Because while they may be navigating their own internal process, your alignment remains unchanged. Your behavior remains consistent. Your presence remains grounded. And this consistency is what reinforces the reality of the situation, because it shows that what they are now realizing is not something new. It is something that has always been there, something that is now being seen more clearly as their perspective shifts. And this clarity is what allows the embarrassment to transform into understanding. Because once the initial discomfort begins to settle, there is an opportunity for deeper reflection, an opportunity to recognize not just what happened, but why it happened, to understand the role that comparison played, the way competition emerged, the way perception influenced behavior. And this understanding is what creates the potential for growth, because it moves the focus from external judgment to internal awareness, from reacting to what is seen to learning from what is understood. And this shift is what ultimately changes the dynamic, because it allows the experience to be integrated rather than resisted. And as this integration takes place, the energy surrounding the situation begins to change. It becomes less about tension and more about resolution, less about defending positions and more about accepting reality. And this is where the embarrassment begins to lose its intensity, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer the primary focus. It becomes part of a larger process of understanding, part of a journey that leads to a more accurate perception of both you and themselves. And this is where the true impact of your presence becomes clear. Because it was never about creating conflict. It was about revealing truth. And that truth has now reached a point where it can no longer be ignored, where it has been seen, felt, and recognized in a way that changes how people engage with the situation moving forward. And this is why the embarrassment they are now feeling is not the end of the process. It is a turning point, a moment where awareness becomes personal, where the realization moves from observation to understanding, and where the dynamic begins to shift from competition to clarity. And within this shift, your position remains the same, steady, aligned, unaffected by the fluctuations around you, because you were never part of the competition. You were simply the presence that revealed it. And now, as that presence continues to remain consistent, it provides the foundation for everything that follows. A foundation built not on perception, but on reality. Not on effort, but on authenticity. And that is what ultimately defines the outcome of this entire experience. Not the arguments, not the competition, not even the embarrassment, but the clarity that emerges from it. A clarity that reflects who you are and what you represent in a way that cannot be undone. The embarrassment they're now feeling deepens into something far more revealing than a simple emotional reaction. Because what they are experiencing is not just discomfort. It is the collapse of a perception they once relied on to define themselves in relation to you. And when that perception falls apart, it creates a moment where they are forced to confront not only what they misjudged about you, but what they misunderstood about themselves. And this is where the intensity of the feeling comes from. Because embarrassment at this level is not surface level. It is rooted in awareness, in the realization that the effort they invested into competing, comparing, and positioning themselves has now been seen in a different light. A light that does not support the image they were trying to maintain. And this shift in light is what exposes everything. Because once people begin to see clearly, they begin to reinterpret past actions, past conversations, past behaviors, and what once felt justified or necessary now begins to feel excessive, misplaced, or even unnecessary. And this reinterpretation is what amplifies the emotional weight of the situation, because it creates a contrast between intention and outcome, between what they believed they were doing and what is now understood about why they were doing it. And this contrast is what brings about a deeper level of reflection, because it forces them to ask questions they may not have considered before. Questions about why they felt the need to compete, why your presence triggered that response, why they invested energy into something that was never meant to be a competition. And these questions do not always have immediate answers, but the act of asking them is what begins to shift their awareness, because it moves them away from external focus and toward internal understanding. And this shift is what makes the embarrassment so transformative, because it is no longer just about being seen by others. It is about seeing themselves more clearly. And that clarity can be uncomfortable, especially when it reveals patterns that were not previously acknowledged. Patterns of comparison, of insecurity, of trying to measure up to something that was never meant to be measured in the first place. And this is where the depth of the experience becomes evident, because it shows that the dynamic was never truly about you. It was about what you reflected, about the way your authenticity highlighted areas where they were not fully aligned. And this reflection is what created the initial comparison, which then evolved into competition. And now, as that competition has fallen apart, the reflection remains. But it is being seen from a different perspective, one that is no longer filtered through the need to compete, but through the need to understand. And this understanding is what begins to reshape their response. Because once they recognize that the competition was not necessary, that it was based on a misunderstanding of your presence, it changes how they interpret the entire situation. It allows them to see that what they were trying to achieve externally is something that can only be developed internally. And this realization is what creates a shift from embarrassment to awareness, because it transforms the experience from something that feels like failure into something that can be learned from, something that can be integrated into a deeper understanding of themselves. And this is where the potential for growth emerges. Because embarrassment, when processed with awareness, can lead to transformation. it can become the starting point for a new level of self-understanding, a new way of engaging with others, a new perspective on what truly matters. And this is where your role becomes even more significant. Not because you are actively influencing their process, but because your presence continues to act as a reference point, a steady example of what authenticity looks like when it is lived rather than performed. And this example provides a contrast that supports their reflection, because it shows that what they were trying to achieve through effort is something that comes naturally when one is aligned with themselves. And this understanding can be both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals the gap that once existed, and empowering because it shows that alignment is possible, that growth is available, that change can happen when awareness is embraced rather than resisted. And as this process continues, the external expression of embarrassment begins to soften. It becomes less about how they are perceived by others and more about how they perceive themselves. And this internal shift is what ultimately determines how the experience will be integrated. Because if they choose to engage with it honestly, if they allow themselves to see the patterns, to understand the dynamics, to acknowledge the role they played, it can lead to a deeper level of clarity that extends beyond this situation. It can influence how they approach future interactions, how they respond to comparison, how they understand their own sense of self. And this is where the experience takes on a broader significance, because it becomes part of a larger journey of awareness, a journey that is not defined by a single moment of embarrassment, but by the transformation that follows it. And within this transformation, your position remains unchanged. You continue to move forward, aligned with your truth, unaffected by the fluctuations of others, grounded in the clarity you have gained. And this grounding is what allows you to remain steady even as others navigate their own process. Because you are no longer influenced by the need to compare or compete, you are anchored in your own understanding. And that understanding is what creates a sense of peace, a sense of stability that is not dependent on external validation. And this is what ultimately defines the outcome of this stage. Not the embarrassment itself, but the awareness it brings, the shift it creates, the clarity it reveals. And as that clarity continues to unfold, it reshapes the dynamic in a way that moves beyond conflict, beyond comparison, beyond the need to prove anything, and into a space where truth stands on its own, where authenticity is recognized for what it is, and where your presence continues to reflect a standard that does not need to be imposed, because it is already understood through the way you exist. And that understanding is what carries everything forward, quietly, steadily, and undeniably. The moment they realize they can't compete with you unfolds not as a loud, dramatic event, but as a quiet internal shift that carries more weight than any external confrontation ever could. Because what is happening within them is a recognition that cannot be undone. A realization that settles in slowly yet permanently, like a truth that has finally found its place after being resisted for far too long. And as this realization takes hold, it begins to reorganize the way they see you, the way they see themselves, and the way they interpret everything that has happened between you. Because they are no longer operating from the illusion that this was ever a fair comparison. They are no longer holding on to the belief that with enough effort, enough strategy, enough positioning, they could match or surpass what you naturally embody. And this shift is what changes everything, because it dissolves the foundation upon which their actions were built. It removes the framework that allowed them to justify competing in the first place. And without that framework, there is nothing left to sustain the behavior. Nothing left to support the narrative that once guided their decisions. And this is where the depth of the moment becomes clear. Because it is not about defeat in the traditional sense. It is about clarity. About seeing something for what it truly is without distortion, without projection, without the need to reinterpret it in a way that preserves their previous perspective. And that kind of clarity can feel overwhelming, because it requires them to let go of the version of reality they had been holding on to. It requires them to accept that what they were measuring themselves against was never meant to be measured in the first place. And as they come to terms with this, they begin to understand that your presence operates on a different frequency, one that is not defined by comparison, not driven by external validation, not influenced by the same factors that govern competitive dynamics. And this understanding is what makes the realization so profound, because it shifts the entire context. It reframes the situation from something that could be approached as a contest into something that exists beyond that framework entirely. And once they see this, once they truly grasp that what you carry cannot be replicated through effort alone, it creates a sense of stillness, a pause in the cycle of reaction and response that had been driving their behavior. And within that pause, there is space for a new perspective to emerge. A perspective that is no longer focused on trying to match you, but on understanding why the need to do so existed in the first place. And this is where the internal work begins. Because the realization that they cannot compete with you is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of a deeper inquiry, one that invites them to explore their own sense of identity, their own sources of validation, their own relationship with authenticity. And as they move into this inquiry, they begin to see that what they were seeking externally is something that must be cultivated internally. That the qualities they admired or envied in you are not things that can be acquired through imitation, but through alignment, through a process of becoming rather than performing. And this shift from performance to authenticity is what marks the true turning point, because it redirects their energy away from comparison and towards self-development. It transforms the dynamic from one of opposition into one of reflection. And this transformation is what allows the situation to evolve beyond its original form. Because once the need to compete dissolves, the tension that sustained it also dissolves. And what remains is a clearer understanding of each person's path. A recognition that you are not in the same lane, not because one is above or below the other, but because the nature of what you are doing is fundamentally different. And this recognition is what brings a sense of resolution, even if it is not immediately acknowledged outwardly. Because internally, the shift has already taken place. The comparison has lost its meaning. The competition has lost its purpose. And in its place, there is a new awareness that changes how they relate to you moving forward. Because they can no longer engage with you from the same mindset. They can no longer approach you as someone to measure themselves against. And this change in approach is what creates a new dynamic. One that is less reactive, less driven by insecurity, more grounded in an understanding of difference rather than hierarchy. And as this new dynamic begins to take shape, it also influences how you experience the situation. Because you are no longer being met with the same energy. You are no longer encountering the same patterns of comparison or competition. And this shift allows you to move more freely, to express yourself without the need to navigate those dynamics, to exist in your own space without being pulled into a framework that does not apply to you. And this freedom is what reinforces your alignment, because it confirms that your path is not dependent on how others perceive or respond to you. It is guided by something deeper, something that remains consistent regardless of external circumstances. And as you continue to move forward from this place, you become even more anchored in that consistency, even more grounded in your own understanding. And this grounding is what allows you to maintain your trajectory without being influenced by the shifts happening around you. Because while others are adjusting to their new awareness, you have already integrated that understanding into the way you live. And this difference in timing is what highlights the nature of your path, because it shows that what is now being realized by others is something you have already been embodying, something you have already aligned with. And this alignment is what makes your presence so distinct, because it is not something you are trying to achieve, it is something you are expressing. Something that flows naturally from the way you understand yourself and your purpose. And this natural expression is what makes it impossible to compete with. Not because it is unattainable, but because it is not based on the same principles that govern competition. It is based on authenticity, on alignment, on a clarity that does not require comparison to validate itself. And as this truth becomes more evident, both to you and to those around you, it continues to reshape the environment in subtle but significant ways. It influences how people engage, how they interpret, how they respond. And over time, these shifts accumulate into a broader change in the dynamic, one that moves away from tension and toward understanding, away from comparison and toward individuality. And within this evolving space, your role remains consistent. You continue to embody the same qualities, the same clarity, the same alignment that have always defined your presence. And this consistency is what allows others to recognize the difference, to see the contrast between what is performed and what is lived. And as they recognize this, it reinforces the realization that began this entire shift. The realization that they cannot compete with you. Not because they are lacking, but because what you represent exists outside the framework of competition. And this understanding is what ultimately brings a sense of closure to the dynamic, because it removes the need for further comparison. It dissolves the motivation to engage in that way. And in doing so, it creates space for a different kind of interaction. One that is not defined by opposition, but by awareness, by respect, by an acknowledgement of difference that does not require hierarchy to be understood. And as this new space continues to develop, it allows for a more balanced and grounded way of relating, one that reflects the clarity that has emerged from this entire process. And within that clarity, your path continues forward, steady and unchanged, guided not by the reactions of others, but by the alignment that has always been at the core of who you are. The shift, where you no longer need to prove anything, emerges as a natural continuation of everything that has unfolded. Because after witnessing the rise and collapse of comparison, the exposure of false narratives, and the quiet realization that others have come to about their inability to compete with what you carry, something within you begins to settle into a deeper level of certainty. A certainty that does not demand recognition, that does not seek validation, that does not require you to explain or defend your position. And this is where your power becomes most evident. Not in what you say, not in what you prove, but in what you no longer feel the need to engage with. Because the energy that once may have been pulled into responding, clarifying, or correcting is now redirected inward, anchored in a calm understanding that your truth does not need to be negotiated or argued into existence. It simply stands. And as it stands, it reveals itself in ways that are far more impactful than any attempt to convince others could ever be. Because when truth is lived consistently, it becomes undeniable. It becomes something that people recognize not through words, but through patterns, through presence, through the way everything aligns without force. And this alignment is what frees you from the cycle of proving. Because you begin to see that the need to prove was never about truth. It was about perception, about trying to manage how others see you, about attempting to control narratives that were never yours to carry. And once you release that responsibility, Once you step out of that cycle, you create space for a different kind of existence. One that is not reactive, not defensive, not driven by the need to correct every misunderstanding, but one that is grounded, steady, and self-sustaining. And within this space, your energy becomes more focused, more intentional, more aligned with your path. Because it is no longer scattered across external conflicts. It is centered within your own direction, your own growth, your own purpose. And this centering is what allows you to move forward with clarity, to make decisions without being influenced by noise, to remain stable even when external situations shift. And as you continue to operate from this place, it becomes clear that the greatest transformation was not in how others see you, but in how you see yourself. Because once you recognize that your value is not determined by external acknowledgement, that your path is not validated by comparison, that your presence does not need to be justified, everything changes. The weight lifts, the pressure dissolves, and what remains is a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. A confidence that is felt rather than displayed, understood rather than explained. And this is where you step fully into your own space, not as a reaction to others, but as a continuation of your own alignment. Moving forward without the need to look back, without the need to measure, without the need to prove. Because you have already arrived at a place where your existence speaks for itself. And that is more than enough. What this entire experience was truly about begins to reveal itself not as a story of conflict, comparison, or even misunderstanding, but as a process of exposure, alignment, and quiet elevation that has been unfolding beneath the surface all along. Because when you look back at everything that has taken place, from the attempts to compete, to the narratives that were created, to the moments where tension seemed to rise without clear reason, you begin to see that none of it was random, none of it was without purpose. It was all part of a larger unfolding that was designed to bring clarity, not only to others, but to you as well. And that clarity is what now allows you to move forward with a level of certainty that cannot be shaken by external noise. Because you have seen what happens when people operate from misunderstanding. You have seen how perception can distort reality, and most importantly, you have seen how truth eventually reveals itself without force, without manipulation, without the need for you to intervene. And this understanding is what becomes your foundation moving forward, because it shows you that your role was never to fight for recognition, never to correct every false narrative, never to engage in every moment of tension. Your role was to remain aligned, to continue embodying your truth, to allow your presence to speak in ways that words cannot. And as you step fully into that understanding, you begin to realize that the greatest victory was never about being seen as right. It was about remaining unchanged in who you are, despite everything that was happening around you. It was about holding your position without becoming reactive, without losing your center, without allowing external dynamics to pull you away from your path. And that is where your true strength lies. Not in opposition, but in consistency. Not in proving, but in being. And as this realization settles in, it brings with it a sense of peace that is not dependent on outcomes, a sense of closure that does not require acknowledgement from others. Because you understand that everything has already aligned in the way it was meant to. The truth has already done its work. The dynamics have already shifted. And now, what remains is simply your continued movement forward. Steady, grounded, and fully aligned with who you are. Carrying with you the awareness that no matter what arises in the future, the same principle will always apply. Truth does not need to fight to exist. It only needs to be lived. And as long as you remain in that space, nothing external can truly disrupt what has already been established within you.